Hello, today we're going to talk about competency 4, which is landmark decisions. This competency covers a lot of material. It's about understanding landmark legislation, executive actions, and Supreme Court cases, and their impact on law and society. A landmark legislation is one that involves the following themes: conflicts and compromises, territorial expansion and the structure and function of government, expansion or restrictions of civil rights or liberties. Notice expansion or restrictions. Expansions or restrictions in social programs, environmental protections, expansions of presidential and war powers. The landmark executive actions are ones that are involved with, no surprise, the president is responsible for foreign policy, for efforts at foreign policy. Again, territorial expansions, restrictions or expansions of civil rights and liberties, the use of executive orders, the presidential bully pulpit, and presidential war powers. And then we look at the landmark Supreme Court cases, and we're actually looking at these in regards to time period instead of looking at just executive by itself and legislative by itself and court case by itself. So the landmark court cases are important cases where decisions that are made had a lasting impact on law and future cases. They have significance because they change the way the Constitution is interpreted. And you may know one of these. I don't know if you've heard of the Miranda law. And this came from a court case, Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, where a poor person didn't know that he had the right to not self-incriminate. And now police have to tell people their rights. So in 1776, well, we have from 1750 to 1799, we tried to take the most essential either amendments, legislation, Supreme Court cases, executive orders that happened during this period. So in 1776, we had the Declaration of Independence was written, and we had a Revolutionary War going on from 1775 until 1783. At this time, there were 8 executive orders, but they weren't as strong as what they might be today. So you'll see that these grow and actually become more like law as time goes on. There were no Supreme Court decisions. So what we do have in this time period, the 10 Bill of Rights, which were amended to our Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, which was done under the Article of Confederation, the Judicial Act, which actually gives the structure for what the Supreme Court could do, and that was in 1789. And then we have, in 1798, something you're going to see again and again, an Alien and Sedition Act. It might be an Alien Act, a Sedition Act, or both together. These are quite common around a war, or for those that know about 9/11, a terrorist attack. So something dramatic like that can cause these types of legislations, executive orders that actually restrict our rights. So the first one, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it had 5 states that were 3 to 5 states that would be allowed to join in this area. And it laid out the conditions for statehood based on population. It emphasized education, and what made it most powerful, it actually prohibited slavery. It also recognized and protected native land rights. And you'll see these being taken away later. But at this point, with this particular ordinance, we see a very different kind of thing than what was happening in some of our states at the time. The Judicial Act of 1789 officially established the U.S. federal court system. The number of Supreme Court justices at that time were only 6. It created 3 circuit courts to hear appeals, established 13 federal district court, and it allowed the Supreme Court to issue writs of mandamus, which were just orders to compel government officials to do their jobs. Then we had the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. We were thinking we might be fighting France, and we had French people living in our territory. Some of them were non-citizens, some were here but with permission to be here. And so in order to be careful that these people wouldn't be like enemies or spies for France, they made some laws. One was the Nationalization Act. They made a change. Instead of waiting for 5 years to become, it moved it to 14 years to live in the country to become a U.S. citizen. The Alien Friends Act, this was for people that the president could deport any non-citizen if the president felt they were danger to our peace and security. Then we had the Alien Enemies Act, and this one you needed, I guess, more compelling evidence, and it did allow the president to apprehend and deport resident aliens, so they had gotten their residency. The Sedition Act was a little bit harsher. It criminalized any false statements critical of the federal government and was aimed at suppressing dissonance. So this was you'll see this again, but not of 1798. From 1800 to 1849, we had a War of 1812, and we're seeing the biggest thing that caused some changes was westward expansion. We also had an amendment, the 12th Amendment there, the Electoral College, because we had some issues with voting. And you'll see there were some executive orders, 3, and we had several legislations, and of the legislations written, all but 1 had to do with westward expansion. Of the executive orders, 2 of them had to do more or less with the expansion. Supreme Court cases weren't really related to expansion, but we'll look at what's going on with westward expansion. The 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, which is an executive order. 1820, the Missouri Compromise. 1821, the Adams and Onis Treaty, which gives us Florida. And the 1830 is the Indian Removal Act. And when you talk about the Louisiana Purchase, we're saying, well, why is this such a big deal? Thomas Jefferson was president. France came and said, do you want to buy this land? He got a very good deal on this land, and people were upset. And they were upset because in the Constitution, it didn't give the power to the president to purchase land. So this becomes a very landmark case in that a president, and it's kind of surprising because Jefferson was an anti-federalist, and here he is taking a lot of power. And so it did cause some conversation, controversy. He did Lewis and Clark exposition. They went up and down and was mapping the area. So I think that people ended up forgiving him in the long run. But it's important because it was taking and expanding presidential power. And then we have the Missouri Compromise. And what happened is it had, again, we have this issue about slavery. And there were 2 new states coming. And they wanted to keep the number of slave states and non-slave states equal if possible. And so what they did is they divided, you can see there's an area, unorganized territory made free by the Missouri Compromise. So these will be free states, and the southern states and one of the newer states would be slave states. Missouri was admitted as a slave state as well, even though it's above the navigation line. It was 36 and 30 minutes, 36 degrees and 30 minutes, and you had to go across. Missouri was above it, but this was just a compromise to try to keep the numbers equal. So Maine was joined. That could be a free state. Missouri could be a slave state. They didn't want to give power to Congress on one side or the other. The 1821 Adams-Odessa Treaty was just a treaty with Spain, and it defined the western limits of the Louisiana Purchase. Spain ceded eastern Florida and just renounced any claims to western Florida. It surrendered any claims to the Pacific Northwest. And in that case, the United States recognized Spanish sovereignty over Texas. Didn't last long, but they did. Then we had a very terrible act, Indian Removal Act legislation in 1830, and it was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, but the legislature wrote it. And this authorized the Native people to have land west of the Mississippi, so they gave up the land that was on the east side, and they didn't want to give it up, of course, and so many tribes went peacefully, but some resisted. And when it was fall and winter of 1838-39, the Cherokees were forced to move west, and many of them died. 4,000 died on what was called the Trail of Tears. So this is again a landmark legislative bill. And then the 12th Amendment, it's kind of silly, but when we were voting before the 12th Amendment, the Electoral College still isn't quite what it should be. But what they were doing is they would take and they would vote, and the people that they didn't have a separate ballot for the president and a separate ballot for the vice president. It'd be the one with the most would be the president, the second most could be the vice president. And in this case, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had agreed that Burr would be his vice president because they got along. They thought it would be cool to work together. But what they had is 73 electoral votes for Thomas Jefferson and 73 electoral votes for Aaron Burr. And they really didn't know what to do with this. They sent it to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives needed 36 ballots and finally elected Jefferson to be the president. So they made the 12th Amendment, where now you would vote for the president and for the vice president on separate ballots. So you wouldn't be the one that had the most, the president, the second most, the vice president. So they are still working on fixing things like this. And then we had in 1819, the McLaurin and Maryland court case. And Maryland, a state, wanted to tax the second bank of the United States, which is a federal bank. And they even claimed that the federal government didn't have a right to have a bank. So it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, under necessary and proper clause, which I know you learned well in that first competency with terms, that it said that the federal government had the right to have the bank, and Maryland couldn't tax this bank because it was unconstitutional as it interfered with federal supremacy. So we're seeing why these are landmark cases. These terms that you learned in the first competency end up, seeing them in action in this particular section. And then we had Marlborough versus Madison, and I love this one too. This particular court case in 1803 actually gave power by the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court to interpret if a law is constitutional. So it is definitely a landmark court case. And then we had Gibbons versus Ogden, and these were two people who had steamboats, and New York gave one steamboat operator complete rights and to be in their harbor and use their waterway, but would not allow Gibbons to do it at all. And so Gibbons took it to court, and he took it to court saying Congress should be able to regulate the commerce, and New York should not have the right to do this and exclude people from using the waterways. Ogden argued on patent grounds, but the case was decided according to Commerce Clause, which gave the federal government supremacy. So Gibbons won, and he could have his use the waterway. The National Bank veto, this is just showing in the National Bank, you already see there's some question marks, should or shouldn't we have a bank? It's probably not written in the Constitution, the federal government can have a bank. And so Jackson thought it was unconstitutional, even though you saw it was determined not to be unconstitutional. And he vetoed allowing the bank to operate again, because they would have to have, the legislation would have to keep saying, yes, we want it for so many years. And Jackson vetoed that, and the legislature just let it go. It ended up not being a good idea to do in hindsight. But at the time, Jackson thought he was doing the right thing. In 1815 till 1899, we have 2 or 3 big things happening. Of course, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And then we have Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. And we still see some continuing westward expansion influences in our amendments or our law or our executive orders or our Supreme Court cases. So the American and Civil War and Reconstruction, you'll see we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And this happened right after the war ended. Slavery was abolished. Citizenship was given to those born or nationalized in the United States. So this law ended up overturning the Dred versus Scott court case, which we'll talk about, that happened in 1857. And then the voting was made for all male citizens, regardless of their race. Then they had a Civil Rights Act. You had in 1861 suspension of habeas corpus. There's a war going on, and people were leaving the battlefield, and they were not wanting to go have a court case. They would just shoot somebody in the back, and that would be it. So court cases on the battlefield could end up with not existing because of this particular law that started at the beginning of the war. We have also the Executive Order Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll look at, and we're going to look at the court cases a little bit more closely as well. So the first court case was in 1857, prior to the Civil War, but it may have had a big impact on the outcome of the North fighting as soon as it did. So Dred Scott was an enslaved African-American, but he was living with his owner and different times in free territories. So he thought he should become free. And not only was he denied his citizenship, but they decided that the Missouri Compromise wasn't good. Every place should be allowed to have slaves, and there should be no Black person in U.S. states and territories. They would be deemed ineligible for U.S. citizenship. So this turned out to be a big issue when Lincoln was running for president in 1858. Then Lincoln in 1863, this was the Emancipation Proclamation, is an executive order. And what he did, a lot of people think he freed all the slaves, but he really didn't free all the slaves. He freed the slaves that were in the rebellious states are henceforth and shall be free. So if you're a slave living in one of the states that said you're leaving and you're fighting the Union, then you're free. And he was hoping that this would cause the slaves in the South to fight against their masters and cause more havoc and make it easier to win the war. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, I put here because sometimes it's being used when I looked at some of the questions that people had. It's being used like a disclaimer, but this is in federal government, when people wanted jobs, it was getting really bad. People in both the North and the South would give jobs based on, what can you give me? Or I'll do this for you and you do this for me and you guys vote for me. And it was becoming what they called the spoil system. And so they wanted to have some people in federal government based on the merit. Could they do the job? So they were giving competent exams to the people in order to have a federal job. So it's not all jobs, but federal jobs. So this was a way to stop corruption. Then we had this is another landmark court case in 1896. The court decided the term separate but equal. So there was a man who was a Black African-American in Louisiana, and he was supposed to take a certain train, I can't remember what they're called. He was supposed to sit in a certain place in the train, and instead of riding in the right one, he was riding where the white men were. And nope, you got to go where the Black people are. And so he took it to the Supreme Court and said that this should be unconstitutional. I should be able to ride anywhere. But the court's decision was not what they had thought. Instead, the court said, well, as long as there's two and it's equal, then it doesn't matter. You can do this. And then what happened in the South is every single government, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, they started making separate bathrooms and separate schools and separate hotels and separate anything you can think of that's public. Whites only, Blacks here. And it was not equal. So I put 1954 Brown versus Topeka schools. You see how many years passed from 1896 till 1954 until this law, this court case that caused this problem was overturned. So other important decisions were the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Homestead Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Treaty of Paris. So Kansas-Nebraska Act is really something to read about. So what happened was they decided, and this is using another term that was in the first competency, popular sovereignty, that they would allow Kansas and Nebraska for the people that lived there, the citizens, to decide if they wanted a free state or a slave state. What would happen is people from surrounding states, even other states like Georgia, would go to Kansas or Nebraska, different states. Anti-slavers and pro-slavers would come, and they were having violent fights against one another. It was almost like the Civil War starting in 1854 in these places that weren't quite states yet. These are territories at this time. And because of this rule, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri compromise with one state, which is what they could have done. Kansas, you'll be slave. Nebraska, you won't, or vice versa. Instead, they could both decide. And so the people for slaves were hoping both would be for slaves. The people that were against slaves were hoping both would be against. So it was a bloody situation. The Homestead Act was actually done in 1862 to encourage people to move to the West. And they could get 160 acres of public land for settlers for a very small fee. And they could improve the land by building it, and they had to do it for like 5 years. And then they could own the land. And one of the issues with this has to do with, as they moved west, there were already natives that had been pushed west. There were also people that were Mexican that lived on the lands. And so it would turn out in many cases, people would be going and taking or wanting lands that may have belonged to someone else. The Treaty of Paris, and this is of 1898, concluded the Spanish-American War, and it was signed in December at the very end of 1989. And this war that they had was actually more international: Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines. And the treaty marked the end of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas. So now Spain has moved out. The Chinese Exclusion Act, and you're going to see this type of thing happen, especially when economy is down, that people get the white native, allegedly native people are here, and they think that the other people are somehow taking their jobs. So Chinese laborers who came to help build the railroad moved to California particularly, but they were living in the West, and they were told that they would not be able to become citizens. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiments at this time because they felt that they were taking jobs. Like here they have in this little cartoon, somebody made a steam washer, and they're saying, we don't want you to do our laundry, and they're chasing them out of town. And it had to do with the Chinese people might charge less money than someone else would charge, so they assume they're taking the jobs away. Then we have from 1900 to 1949. In this period of history, a lot is going on. We had 1917 to 1919 World War I, the U.S. involvement. From 1929 to 1941, we have the Great Depression. 1941 to 1945, U.S. involvement in World War II. So we have two wars and a depression. And some of these actually will be overlapping one another. I'm sure when the war started, it wasn't like the depression just disappeared. But these are just time periods that help us understand these periods. So World War I, if you're a guy and you're 18 to, I can't remember, 26, you have to do the Selective Service Act. You have to register. And so this started in 1917. And some people thought this was quite unfair. But then in the same time, since a lot of people that were men were leaving and we still needed war supplies, females started to work. And they went into the military. A lot of people, don't recognize that, but they also were in the factories. So as this war is ending, the women are suddenly, they are being recognized, maybe for this, a multiple different reasons, but they're being recognized, and the women get their vote in 1920. And then the rest of these you're going to see have a lot to do with the war. We have the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. So you guys can guess it's going to take away rights. They wanted to prevent interference with military operations. They wanted to prevent the support of U.S. enemies during wartime. And they granted the government broad powers to prosecute those that they captured and deemed guilty of such act. Then in 1918, they amended the Espionage Act because people were starting to say that the Service Act was not fair, the draft wasn't fair, and they found that kind of talk wasn't good for the war. So they wanted to restrict freedom. And they said that, this is where we get they said that it's a crime to criticize the government or the Constitution, the military, or the flag. And it turned out that there was one man and there was a woman working with him, but it was him that took it to the Supreme Court. He was arrested because he was saying, and he was writing pamphlets and handing them out saying this draft was wrong. It's wrong for them to do this. We should be able to choose. It's forcing people to be have involuntary servitude. And the Supreme Court didn't do what he thought it would do. He said that this is a clear and present danger to the United States. You can't talk like this. And he said this is where they get the idea that it would be very bad for that if you shouted there's a fire in the theater and you cause panic, that would not be covered by this free speech law. So this decision was something that we hear a lot about. So it set precedents to limit freedom of speech, and particularly during times of war. And he did get convicted, and he was in jail for about 6 months. And then we had the Great Depression, and we got something called the New Deal Act. Many people think the New Deal is like one law. No, this is a whole group of laws. And it turns out that the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, not only pushed for these laws to go through legislation, he wrote executive orders to get some of them started because it was taking too long. So he started the Civilian Conservative Corps, Public Works Administration, Work Progress Administration, which created jobs for individuals who needed them. This is when we started the Social Security Act. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which aimed at regional development, which we will see from time to time. He made some banking reforms because some of the issues that may have caused the Depression related to banks. And then he did measures to help the people working for agriculture, the farmers, in their jobs, because they also were going hungry. So in 1941 to 45, we have now the New Deal programs were helping people, get back on their feet. But in the meantime, we have another war. When Japan bombed Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, we were forced to go to war. So what happened in this time period, again, we said during times of war, what can happen is people's freedoms can be taken away. In this case, it was an executive order, and it targeted Japanese Americans, and they put them in internment camps. They felt that they lived on the California coast, they could be helping the Japanese. And so they did that, and the Supreme Court case on this page, which was in 1944, directly relates to the Japanese internment. So if you can recognize Korematsu is a Japanese name, you would understand, you could guess that it relates to internment. He felt his rights were being taken away, took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court backed the federal government and said, no, you have to be in internment. Your rights were not violated. A good executive order at this time was desegregation of the Army. So here we have the executive order for when Harry S. Trump desegregated the military. And this actually laid the groundwork for subsequent civil rights advancement. It didn't get rid of everything. As everybody knows, there's still issues, but it was facing it for the first time. And this is the Japanese internment, and they took everything. Many people went back after their internment, after the war was over. Their houses were taken over by someone, or the bank just took them away and sold them to someone else. So it was not a nice time in our government. Then in 1949 to 1999, we had another war in 1961, in this time period, the Vietnam War, and we had another great push for civil rights. So some of the amendments that were done was the presidential term limits, and we got rid of poll taxes. And poll taxes, so that there's an actual amendment, Amendment 24, because what would happen is states in the South particularly would say if a person wanted to vote, they had to be able to answer these particular questions. And in many cases, it was only Black people that had to answer these specific questions, and they were made so they couldn't answer them, and so they couldn't vote. So they said you can't do this, have pay, or you also can't have these kind of quizzes for people to vote. They lowered the voting age to 18. People were saying if we're fighting in a war, we should be able to vote. So they just lowered the age to 18. And then we're going to see some great legislation, the Great Society legislation of 1864, the Tonkin Goff Resolution, the Clean Air Act, the Voting Rights Act, because again, covering those issues related to voting. And then we'll see some great Supreme Court decisions and executive orders you'll see relate to some of the things that were happening at the time. So I wanted to show you the Great Society legislation. It really, LBJ's blueprint for the Great Society was almost what was happening with the New Deal. The economics were really bad, and social issues were really bad, and he wanted to do something to make it better. One of the things in it is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin in public facilities, employment, and federally funded programs. Then we have the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. We have the Food Stamp Act of 1964. The Elementary School and Secondary Education Act, and this was in 1965, but it still was part of his blueprint for the war on poverty. And so he wanted the people that were economically disadvantaged, and they were going to elementary schools and secondary schools in poorer areas to have improved educational opportunities. And then to the Social Security Act, he added Medicare and Medicaid because people needed health care. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, now this should have been clear-cut. The president, Johnson, there was a war going on in Vietnam. France was fighting it, and they wanted our involvement. And he went to the legislature. In the legislature, they didn't declare war. What they did is authorize President Johnson that he could do whatever he need, what necessary measure in Southeast Asia to fight for this. So basically, this is expanding presidential war powers without actually declaring war. So the constitutionality of this situation has been questioned. In 1970, because of this issue, they just repealed it. The Congress just repealed it. And then they actually did the War Powers Resolution in 1973 to limit the president's ability to commit the U.S. troops without congressional approval. And we would think this is all good, but wait and see what happens further on in time. So the Brown versus the Board of Education and Desegregation, here's our little friend, she's going, and this is Miss Brown, and she's living even today. But we had the separate but equal education law, and it wasn't, they weren't equal. And so she won her court case, and yet she was having a hard time because they said it was the racial minorities. It's unequal. It's violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So they had to make an executive order. Eisenhower made an executive order to send troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, so that this young lady could go to school. From 2000 to 2050. So this is our period. I don't know how many of you were living when September 11 happened, when the two Twin Towers, and they went down. And this was really a big issue because the U.S. had never had such an attack on our soil by a foreign entity, because we did have a civil war, but by a foreign entity. So this was a big deal, and you're going to see again how we give up some of our rights in order to have more security. And then we had a housing crisis in 2008. And of course, I think you all will remember from 2019 to 2023 when we had the pandemic. No amendments were written in this period of time, but we had a lot of legislation, and one of them in 2001, and then there was one in 2002, and I don't know if there was another one. It's called Authorization of Military Force. And it turned out that the president got the same power that Lyndon Johnson got for the Tonkin. So we're going to look at that a little more in depth, and the Patriot Act. The Economic Stimulus Act, when we had the housing issue, we got funds to help with that. The Affordable Care Act is when President Obama gave us a health program that actually did go to the Supreme Court, and parts of it were declared unconstitutional, but other parts were constitutional. So we have parts of it, but not the part where people have to pay for health insurance. The CARES Act directly related to the pandemic. And then we had the executive order, which President Obama did, deferred action for childhood arrivals. These young people are still waiting for some resolution to it. President Obama wrote the executive order. President Trump tried to get rid of it. It went to the Supreme Court. It came back, and now I heard it's up there again. And we don't know what will happen to these children who are now adults who came to our country by their parents, and then they found out later in life they weren't U.S. citizens. So, and then we have several different Supreme Court cases. One is legalization of the same-sex marriage, but I wanted to look at the Citizens United versus FEC, as it could affect something that's in our state. So the Patriot Act, what it did was, after this war, expanded surveillance ability of law enforcement. It was easier to get interagency communication, which I think this is the one good thing that came out of it. The FBI would keep secrets from the police, and the police would know something and not tell this group. And then you had Homeland Security, and even CIA was it. All these groups were collecting information but not sharing. So now for terrorism, they needed to work together, and we have the Homeland Security to do that. There were increased penalties for terrorism, and there was an expanded list of activities which would qualify for terrorist charges in court. One of the things they ended up doing is not having warrants if they suspected terrorism. And there were lots of drug cases that they would just say, oh, we suspect terrorism, and they would get warrantless searches. So, I mean, this act had it could have some abuses to it. And so the 2001, 2002, 2001, it authorized the Afghanistan. The president could take authority to go into Afghanistan to look for terrorism. In 2002, the president said, oh no, it's Iraq that has some of these bad terrorists, and we need to be able to do that. So they extended, there was no war declared again, and Congress delegated broad war powers to the president. And so this little comic that I have here it's the Persian Gulf, and it has the Gulf of Tonkin. They're saying they're actually doing the Vietnam in the middle of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Persian Gulf, Kuwait to do Iraq. And it says, do we feel like we were here before? So it's the same issue that's going on, that the president may have too much power. So here we're not really looking at, is this a right, wrong? It's the expansion of the power of presidency. And should he have that power? Should Congress have declared war? Should Congress have given him, the president, all that power? Will it lead to tyranny? And then I like the Citizen United case that was done in 2010, only because it could affect us in Florida with Disney. Yeah, it turns out the Supreme Court case, there was the Citizens United and FEC. They went to court because the corporation was giving money to legal, entities. They felt like senators and whoever, different senators and representatives, they're giving them money, and they're saying you shouldn't be able to do this. This is wrong. And the corporations were saying, hey, we have the right to free speech as a corporation. We should be able to give money to people we want to give money. This is our money. And the Supreme Court, they said corporations are people too, basically. They said, you're right, you can give money to whom you want in political action. So they now can freely give money to different political entities. And how does this relate to the Disney case? Well, the Disney, as some of you may know, was saying things against DeSantos's laws. And DeSantos was upset and is attacking Disney on several fronts. And it's going to be another court case. But Disney, if they're using this particular precedent as a case, should be able to win it because they have the right to say that, because corporations are people. So some final thoughts. I hope you're seeing how you can take these cases and look at them. Look at like restrictions of rights during war and why does that happen. And if you just want to sit and chat about some of these landmark cases and how they affect the different cases in the future, I mean, feel free to come to the Learning Commons at any time, but just try to look at each case, not is it right or wrong, but how does it expand your rights or take away from rights? Does it expand that entity when we're talking about the legislature or the executive or the Supreme Court? Does it give them more power, less power? What's going on with that as it relates to our Constitution? So good luck and thank you for listening.